Hello, it's Ruby, and today I'm going to be talking through all of the books I read in January. And today, consulting my beautiful journal, which, as you can see, I've decorated with. This is from a dictionary, and then I've got this stamp and some stickers, and this is the notebook where I'm journaling about all of the books and content that I read in 2025, and so far I'm really enjoying this as a system. I've got to say that I'm always a couple of books behind, or a couple of articles behind, because I'm not quite in the routine yet where as soon as I finish something I pick this up, and I want to get to that point because I think that will just make sense to the system. It doesn't take very long to journal at all in this, but at the moment it's a tiny bit more sporadic, so I'll suddenly remember that I haven't filled this in, and then I will sit down and just get everything down, but I probably would rather just do it regularly. Before we do get started going through the books that I read in January though, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, which is Book of the Month. This is so exciting. Honestly, this package is so distinctive. I've seen so many people online unboxing these, and I've been tempted by a subscription for a really long time, and then they reached out and the books on the lineup looked amazing for this month. Both of these books that Book of the Month have sent me are on my TBR now for February, and I'm so excited to read both of them. We've got not one, but two books. Oh, and there's also a cute little bookmark. That's so lovely. Fiction forward. Book of the Month is a book subscription. Every single month, you get to choose from a selection of titles, and then you are sent something new to read, and all of these are curated. The team at Book of the Month has gone through and chosen some of the best new releases in different genres as well. I love it as a way for discovering new books as well. Both of these books I did not know were out until I saw them on the list for Book of the Month, and I'm so excited about both of them. So it's a way to find a new author, a new kind of book, a new genre that you maybe wouldn't have usually found. These are the two books that I've chosen, just doing a quick sneak preview. I'm gonna start with this one because it's the one that I'm most excited about. I was so I was over the moon to see this author's name there on this list. I did not realise that she had written another book. So it's basically about this mother and her daughter who move to this man Arthur's isolated cabin in the mountains. It's just the three of them, dark and desolate. It says together they catch salmon, pick berries and climb mountains that seem tall enough to touch the bright blue sky. But soon Birdie discovers that Arthur is something much more mysterious and dangerous. It's a Book of the Month special edition. And then the other book is this one, which is The Bones Beneath My Skin by TJ Klune, and it says that this is good for fans of Stranger Things. It is sci-fi, but it looks I don't know, I don't like high sci-fi books, and just I don't like high fantasy books, but this is set within the real world, but there are sci-fi elements. In the spring of 1995, Nate Cartwright has lost everything. His parents are dead, his only brother wants nothing to do with him, and he's been fired from his job. He returns to his family's summer cabin in rural Oregon, and he meets this man and a 10-year-old girl who is extraordinary, and it seems like she has special powers, but it doesn't distinctly say what those powers are in the blurb. I'm really looking forward to this. I love a book like this. I love books that are set in the middle of nowhere, and both of these are set in really rural, desolate locations, and I do love a good sci-fi element. Really excited about both of these books. I can't wait to read them in February. Both of these books are for February, and so if you wanted to try either of these books, or if you wanted to try a future month, then you can get your first book of the month for just $9.99, and that's if you use the code CRUSH. But there'll be a link in the description box. I'm so excited about both of these books, if you couldn't already tell, and without further ado, I'm now going to tell you about the books that I read last month. Alright, so the first book I read, let's see. I will also say that I did a readathon at the beginning of this month, and so I spoke about some of those books then. The first book I read this year was For One More Day by Mitch Albom. So Mitch Albom wrote Tuesdays with Morrie, and then also the 5 People You Meet in Heaven. I loved both of these. My family really loves Mitch Albom's work, so we kind of collectively are just reading everything he's written. So my sister lent me this one. It's basically about this man whose mother died a couple of years ago, 6 or 7 years ago, and after his mother's death he fell into a deep depression and everything seemed to lose meaning. His life fell apart, his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, just everything fell apart, and so 7 years later, and he attempts suicide, and in the liminal space between life and death, he gets to spend one final day with his mother. Having just been in this car accident, he knocks and his mother answers the door, and he spends one complete day with her, where they have breakfast together. They go through all of the motions of how that ordinary life together used to look, and in doing so they kind of remember moments from their past and they reflect on them, and he feels gratitude to her, and it's kind of all him finding closure, and he gets a chance to tell her what he always wanted to tell her. It's really deeply moving, deeply sad, as you can imagine, and I think it's just excellent at like capturing the complexity of like a moral spirit, as opposed to it just being that both characters are idealized. Like they both feel very real. It's highly life affirming. It reaffirms the importance of family, the centrality of family, why we need to spend time with our families, and also like most beautiful thing is like how much love we do not see, like how much is happening under the surface that we just never notice. Like, you know that quote, the greatest tragedy is that you're more loved than you'll ever know, which I think is Ruby Carr. So I wrote, Chick only realises the extent of his mother's love, like kind of through meeting her again. I will say though, and I did add a note in this journal too, that it's my least favourite of the Mitch Albom books that I've read, which isn't saying much because like I really did enjoy this, but I probably would give this like 3.5 stars. But that was book number 1. Then this is where I started my readathon, I believe. I'm so sure I read one in between that I just didn't like write down. I document all of my books on Storygraph, like everything I'm reading, and I don't leave reviews. It's literally just that otherwise I will forget the names of everything I read. So it's a way to like track everything, and I like how if I search like an author, I can see what books by them I've already read. Okay, yes, so then I started the readathon, and the first book I read in that readathon was Invisible Cities by Italo Calvino. I read If on a Winter's Night a Traveller years ago when I was like 17, and I really enjoyed it. I loved how experimental it was. Like If on a Winter's Night a Traveller speaks in the second person, it switches between genre, it's like confusing but in a fantastic way. Kind of the confusion is the point, and there is similarly a sense of confusion in Invisible Cities because all of these cities are invisible. Like they're not real and they're not supposed to be real, and you're not supposed to be mapping them onto actual geographic locations, but it's this traveller who's moving between cities and really loves cities, and he's like constantly getting like from one to the next. And I love this part where about halfway through he is like travelling between 2 cities and he's in the middle of nowhere and everything looks the same. Like he's looking at these like rolling fields and he's like, it all looks the same, how do I know where I'm going, have I been here before? And he meets this shepherd who says the opposite and says, I know every single undulation of this plain, whereas if I go to a city I couldn't tell you which one it was because they're all bustling and they all look the same. And I love that just for like perspective. So Invisible Cities is like separated into lots of very short descriptions of different cities, and it's all like through a dialogue and conversation with, I think he's a king of some kind, and the traveller is recounting his adventures and his journeys and the cities he's seen. The thing I love most about it though is how it kind of gets you to reflect on your own travels and places that you've been, and see travelling as inherently individualistic and almost solipsistic. Like we're all going to have a completely different interpretation of a city, and because of how we approach the city we're going to see it differently. Like the city itself is not a static like real thing, it's more about how it exists in relation to the person looking at it. And I said in my review that if Italo Calvino had written about real cities it wouldn't have had the same effect. Couldn't have shown that like the same city is different for everyone, because when you read like, oh this is New York, you would have read it through your own interpretation of New York, I think. And I also loved nostalgia in this book. If you're a fan of themes of nostalgia and youth, then that pops up again and again, especially with the cities that he visited as a young man and then he revisits. Now for the next book, which was Orbital by Samantha Harvey, which of course won the book of this year. I had heard so many mixed things about this book, and still when I've had conversations about it since reading it, everyone's reaction is so mixed. The key thing to remember about this book is it's not fast-paced and it's not plot-driven. And as a result, I would not describe this book as a page turner. There are some really long tangents where characters are ruminating and thinking on certain things, and some of that is actually quite boring. There were some detours I was like, I'm not really excited by this, I'm not riveted by this. The jumps between the different astronauts on the spaceship can also be quite confusing, it can feel quite disjointed, but I can see why it won the Booker, because it's doing something interesting with fiction. As soon as you hear the blurb of Orbital, like when I read the blurb, I was thinking, is it going to be like The Martian by Andy Weir? Is it going to feel quite sci-fi, quite fast-paced? From the blurb, it feels like it's going to be a sci-fi book, and I've spoken with people who've said that they're put off from reading Orbital because they don't like sci-fi, but it's really not sci-fi. It's realist fiction, and it feels incredibly realist even though they just so happen to be in space. In many ways, I think it humanizes astronauts and space missions and kind of just makes them very real and very human. The narrative is so introspective, so focused on the lives and thoughts and backstories of the different people who are on the spacecraft. You don't really learn about what their mission is. Maybe it was there, but I never picked up on why exactly they were in space and what the kind of specifics of their missions were, because that wasn't the heart of the narrative. Like, the heart was the people. So basically, in short, I've said all of this without even saying what it's about. It's 6 people, I think it's 6, who are on a spacecraft, and they're orbiting, they're in orbit around planet Earth, and it's basically just like the everyday of these people, and it switches between them, but nothing's really happening, it's just them reflecting. And so it's very slow, very introspective, jumps between the different astronauts. All of them kind of intertwine, which I think is possibly reflective of the way that all of their lives are kind of piled on top of each other from within the spacecraft, like they're all becoming tangled. And it's very much reflecting on the fragility of Earth from space, and it brings war and politics hugely into question, as for one, you've got people from several nationalities living together on the spacecraft, but also as they're looking down on planet Earth, there's like a harmony, there's a unity, as they think, why on earth are we allowing the planet to be destroyed and hurt and kind of taken advantage of in the way that we are. So it's a really beautiful eco-narrative, and having that perspective from space gives a very unique eco-narrative that I haven't seen before. But you've got like the macro as they look down on Earth, but then you've also got these beautiful, tender, mundane moments, and the things that they miss most about Earth are things like cycling, or like the way that a sun ray falls down from the sky, or they're tiny things, and it really encourages you to like take those moments not for granted and really appreciate them for how wonderful they are. I did really enjoy it. If you like an introspective book, I think you'd like this, but if you predominantly like plot-based books, then you could give this a go, but it might not be your favourite. Next, I read Keedy by Elle McNicoll. This is the prequel to A Kind of Spark. Both of these books are about autism. The protagonist is autistic, and in A Kind of Spark, you've got 11-year-old Addie who's starting in senior school for the first time, and Keedy is her older sister. But this book is set several years before, I think when Keedy is in year 9, and it's her experience in high school as an autistic teenager. I spoke about this extensively in the readathon that I did earlier this month, but I just love how Elle McNicoll represents autism in her books and neurodivergence in her other books, and she provides accurate depictions of neurodivergence, which is so important, especially in middle grade books where this might be a child's first introduction to what autism is, and that can provide empathy. It can help a child understand kind of autistic peers or people they know, and neurodivergent representation in fiction as a whole is just very low. So Elle McNicoll has done such important, valuable work through her writing. I very much admire her. But I talk about the autistic representation in that like very extensively in the other video, and I think I'll just repeat myself if I talk about it here, but in short, it's about Keedy setting up an anti-bullying agency because her school isn't taking bullying seriously, and I just love how righteous and loyal Keedy is as a character. She's kind of wonderful, and there are some really beautiful emotional moments between her and Addie as well, like lovely conversations. I would highly recommend this book if you've read A Kind of Spark. But I would say to read A Kind of Spark first. Then I read another YA middle grade book, which is One by Sarah Crossan, which won the Carnegie Medal back in like 2016. The unique thing about this book is it's written entirely in free verse, so there are like huge jumps kind of visually on the page, and I've never read a book totally in verse like this before. I mean, obviously I've read things like Homer's The Odyssey and John Milton's Paradise Lost, which are epic poems, but I haven't read a novel in free verse. It's about these two conjoined twins, and they're 16 and they're starting school for the first time. They've never been to school before because their parents have always been worried about bullying, etc. And it's like 4 months in their life as they start this new school, and it's really sad and it's really beautiful, and it's a very quick read too, so I'd say it's well worth a read. If you're at all intrigued by the premise of that, and you also like quite lyrical, like poetic writing, then it's very good. Beautiful reflections on sisterhood too. Then I read Heaven is for Real by Todd Burpo, or is it Carson? Yeah, I think it's Todd Burpo's the dad, and then Carson's his son. Colton is his son. So Colton, when he was 4, had a near-death experience, and he supposedly went to heaven and he saw Jesus and he saw his late grandfather as well. I'm very interested in near-death experiences. I've heard about Colton Burpo's story before, and I've watched interviews related to it, and so I've just been meaning to read this for a while. It's quite heavy-handed, and keep in mind that the dad who's writing it is a minister, and so it's not necessarily coming from a completely unbiased place, but some of the coincidences, some of the things that Colton kind of knew or saw are like kind of crazy, and it's interesting. If you're interested in near-death experiences, it might be worth a read, but I wasn't particularly impressed by the writing. Like, I feel by and all that memoirs aren't written as well as other kinds of books. Like, I love a good memoir on occasion, but it's not my favourite genre. Then I read some short stories by Chekhov. It was just from the Little Black Penguin books, which I really like because they give you a selection of key writings by a particular writer. I did end up reading all of the ones in this collection, but the only one I've written about here is Gooseberries, because that was my favourite one, and it's the one I really want to remember, and kind of I can imagine myself rereading it. It's not very long as well, it is a short story. So it's about this man who, as a young man, decides that he wants to live in the countryside in a manor house with gooseberry bushes. The gooseberry bushes are very important because when he envisions this life for himself, he thinks a good country house always has gooseberry bushes. It's one of like the symbols of like prosperity that he himself has for some reason devised, and I really like that as an image because it shows how subjective and how like internally biased we are without even realizing it, and how impressionable we are to tiny moments that we've been exposed to as children. So I really love that as an image, and basically this man will do anything to get there. He has this goal and he will sacrifice anything. So he lives completely within his means and below his means. He does have money and he has a job, but he begs and he cheats people and he just does whatever he possibly can in order to save and accumulate this money, which means that he can move to a country house. He even marries a rich widow and then waits for her to die so that he can get all her money. Like, this guy is awful. He's horrible. He's awful. I feel like Chekhov, like Dostoevsky, is very good at writing complex and not very likable characters. Like, I did not like this man at all. So he does ultimately get what he wants, and ends up moving to this house, but it feels so deeply vacuous because of what you know has gone into securing that future for himself. Like, as he's walking around, he's describing the beauty, and I think it's his brother who comes to visit him, and through his eyes we're seeing all of this, you know, this grandeur and the servants, huge house and the gardens and especially the gooseberries, and it just feels so meaningless because you know of how much cruelty has allowed him to get there. Like, it's so just inhuman. And it also has these reflections about the morality of happiness and whether it's ethical for us to be happy, which I don't like as a narrative. I don't think it's a very helpful narrative. Interesting question to raise, always an interesting question, and I appreciate the conversation, but I'm quite stuck on like happiness being a good thing for us to try and chase. So it feels like quite a cynical perspective. Kind of like William Hazlitt on hating and talking about how we love hating and hating is a really human thing. I don't really like kind of hyper cynical narratives like that. I don't know how helpful and pragmatic they are. Next I read Letters from Fairyland by Charles. I need to just check this. I do have it on my bookshelf, I think. This is it. I got this from the Folio Society for my 18th birthday and I never read it because I was saving it, and I was like, it's so beautiful that I don't want to read through it. And so I've kind of looked through it and I've read extracts, but I've never read the whole thing, and it's really, really short. But it's all in facsimile. I think they only printed like 200 of these, and it was the year that I turned 18, and so my mum surprised me with this and I was, you know, over the moon to receive it. Printed on this like beautiful cardstock paper, and it's got all these watercolor illustrations. And then the wonderful thing is there are all of these letters, and you just kind of like slip them out, and these are letters which have been written between the author and the people of this fairyland. It's like they're letters to and from fairies, and it's just so charming. It kind of feels a bit like Beatrix Potter. It kind of gives you that same feeling when you read them. And I love the blurring between reality and fiction and fantasy, because obviously these are like material objects which are supposedly coming from the fairies. It's so charming, and if you're interested in like kind of lore of fairies with this kind of charming fantasy, then I'd recommend trying to get your hands on this. I loved it. And there is a story to it. It's kind of the artist and the author is commissioned by the King of Fairyland to go and paint a picture for him. It's really lovely. Then the next book I read was a completely different genre and feel, which was The House of My Mother by Shari Franke. I'm sure you've seen this book. I don't want to say I'm sure you've seen it, but I feel like this book has been spoken about so much on social media recently, and I'm so pleased that it is being spoken about. But Shari Franke is the eldest daughter of the 8 Passengers family, who posted YouTube videos from maybe like 2015 to 2021 every single day. I actually watched their videos every single day. Growing up, it was the only YouTube channel that I consistently watched every single day. Before bed, I would put on their latest vlog and I would watch it. And so when it was revealed that these children had been abused the whole time through that channel, and kind of even more so afterwards, absolutely heartbreaking and kind of so terrifying that there are so many people who were watching every single day and did not even realise like what was happening. And upon reading the book, like I feel so incredibly guilty as a viewer. I really regret like having supported them, and like as every viewer, like been part of why they were able to continue. It's just really shocking. And so Shari's book is so important for kind of really shedding light on the reality of family vlogging channels, and my perspective has changed a lot. Like when I was watching them, I was young, I was like under 18 predominantly, and then like slowly since then my perspective on family vlogging has changed and I don't support it anymore. I used to like not really understand what the problem was with it, whereas now I do not agree with family vlogging. The book was a really important and like very moving one to read, and it goes the whole way through from her parents' first meeting. So it starts with Ruby and Kevin meeting when they were at college, and then like kind of the early childhood, and then it goes into their time with the 8 Passengers channel, and then the really kind of harrowing when they went into like the kind of cult of connections with Jodie Hildebrandt. It doesn't really focus on the period where like 8 Passengers was really popular and lots of people were watching it, but there were some moments that are contextualized through the book, like when Shari supposedly had like accidentally shaved off her eyebrow, and it like contextualizes that again. Like I remember watching that video, and so kind of hearing the background of like actually what was happening around that video was really confronting and deeply sad. Like it was a really moving book and I did cry. And one thing I will say as well is Shari has done such a wonderful job. Like it's so sensitively done. I can't imagine it being done more sensitively. She decides not to name her 4 youngest siblings because she doesn't want them to like have to be exposed publicly any more than they've already had to be through the vlogging channel, and she doesn't like go into any details about them, and I just hugely respect that she's done it like that. Yeah, it's a really sad book, and I would very much recommend it for anyone who watched 8 Passengers growing up. I think it's quite an important one to read if you watched 8 Passengers. So then next I read Mourning and Melancholia by Freud, which was not terribly engaging, I will say. I didn't enjoy reading this. It was very dense. I read it because I read this article by, I think it was David Klopper, and it was on nostalgia, and Mourning and Melancholia was mentioned in that. So I was like, oh, well, I kind of want to read the source text because I was struggling to get an idea of the argument from Freud from the Klopper article. The piece kind of explores the relationship between mourning and melancholia as two different kinds of sadness, wherein mourning is a circumstantial kind of sadness where you're reacting to a physical loss, and then melancholy is similarly linked to loss, but you don't know what's been lost. So Freud says the thing lost is, quote, shifted onto the own person's ego, and that melancholia is ultimately regressive. I mean, as ever with Freud, it's interesting because it's influential, but there are some very damaging and problematic statements and ideas in this piece, especially around how you react to people who are depressed. It's just really insensitive and judgmental of people who are feeling depressed, and I don't know, I was kind of quite shocked by some of the things that I read. Next I read Wintering by Katherine May, which had been so high on my TBR for ages. I bought it 3 or 4 years ago, but I hadn't read it, simply because I wanted to read it in January and I wanted to read it in winter. It was never the right time to start it. I'd always get to the end of January and be like, oh no, I haven't read Wintering yet. And so this year I was like, I need to start reading it before the 14th of January. So it's kind of nature writing, but more seasonal writing and reflections, because it's not like she's writing from within the middle of nowhere. It's not like it's a Thoreau, Walden situation. It's simply this woman who is in a period of convalescence because she's been very unwell, and she decides to take time off work and tap into the act of wintering and pay attention to the seasons and pay attention to winter. And through the book, which is separated into months, she shows us kind of how she's doing this, but also explains and explores and researches the history of winter. And it's educational, but it's also beautifully written, and it makes you fall in love with winter all over again. If you're somebody who doesn't like winter, this is a really great book to read. And if you're someone who does love winter like me, then you'll just fall more in love with it, and it's a very cozy one. I also learned a surprising amount. I wasn't expecting to learn so much, but this is one of the best books I've ever read. Definitely my best book of January. Next I read The Teachers by Alexandra Robbins. So Alexandra Robbins is a journalist, and she's also written The Overachievers, The Secret Lives of Driven Kids, which is my favourite non-fiction book ever. Then a book about sororities, and in all 3 of these books she goes undercover for a year and she interviews different people and kind of infiltrates the system of overachievers, sororities, and now teachers. And I just love the format of it. I've never read anything else like this. The format is just so interesting and wonderful, and it's really engaging, and you hear the stories of real people, but you also get statistics and research, so you learn a lot. And so The Teachers follows 3 teachers over the course of a year, and this is written post-COVID as well, so it does have a section on the impact of COVID, but it just shows how bad the teaching climate is in the US. So covers things like school funding, parent complaints, cliques within teachers, and then kind of very significantly school shootings and the impact of school shootings on teachers and how it changes how the profession works. It also very much captures how rewarding it is to work with young people and why people stick around in the teaching profession. But I think it's a very important one to read. You could read it from anywhere, but especially if you're in the US, I think this is one you should read. So the next book I read was Time Travelling with a Hamster by Ross Welford, and I really enjoyed this. So the book is about a 12-year-old boy whose father died 4 years before, and then on his 12th birthday he gets a letter from his late father telling him that he can save his life, and that his father has built a time machine which is in the basement of that old house. And so he's given instructions on how to go back in time to when his father was his age and basically save his life. But when he goes back, he accidentally kills his father. And I just love all the questions that the book raises around time travel. I love how it explains relativity theory to young people, which is just so cool. The whole book is just very, very clever, and I love any book about time travel. I feel like time travel is so much fun to read about, and all of the inconsistencies is kind of very much this book based around the idea of if you kill your father, then do you cease to exist? It's fab, so I would highly recommend. Also, the grandfather, my favourite bit, and I actually wrote this in my journal, is the grandfather has a memory palace like Sherlock, and he stores a key story-worthy moment from every single day. So at the end of the day, he kind of like stores it away in his mind palace, and it means that you can say to him like, what happened on January 1st 2002, and he can tell you because he's got one beautiful memory from that day. And I'm just so inspired by this, and I'm intrigued, has anyone done this? Because that seems like such a wonderful way to remember your life. Then I read There Lives a Young Girl in Me Who Will Not Die by Tove Ditlevsen. She is a Danish poet. She lives in Copenhagen, and she reads a lot like Mary Oliver or Sylvia Plath, deeply reflective poetry about the female experience, and it's just so beautiful. It's so tender and it's so raw as well. It feels kind of, some of her poems feel very much like stream of consciousness and just her thinking. It's simple but it's powerful, and there's so much on nostalgia, on looking back on childhood, and they're my favourite themes when reading poetry. I will say though that I loved her early poetry and her late poetry, but there was one anthology in the middle from the adults from 1969, and those poems stretch from page 65 to page 111. I've been so in love with these poems, and I was, reading them so slowly, really taking them in, and then I got really confused. I was like, why am I not enjoying this anymore? And then I flipped to the front and I realised that like all of the poems I wasn't enjoying were from the same anthology, so just kind of thematically, I guess, that one I didn't like as much. I think, and also it makes sense with it being from an anthology called The Adults, but it just felt like kind of more clinical. The poems were much more realist than memory-based and nostalgic, which all of the other anthologies seem to focus on. And there was much more like domestic imagery and just real imagery. I just didn't really find it as moving or as emotional, so. But by and all, I loved this, with the exception of that one anthology. Then, final two books, I read Totally Deceased by Sue Cunningham, which, moment of silence for this book. It was excellent. So great for any fan of Holly Jackson, if you liked One of Us is Lying series. If you love a mystery book and you love a thriller, then this is a book you have to add to your TBR. It only came out last year and it's just such a great premise. I'm going to tell you the premise, and then you're going to, if you like this genre, just have to go and buy it because it's so addictive. I read it in one night. Like, I got home from work and then I read the whole book and I finished it that night. It's about this 17-year-old Jess who receives a heart transplant, and then the girl who gave her the heart, the girl who died and then gave her heart, starts haunting her. Like, the ghost of this girl, Tilly, starts haunting her, and Tilly wants Jess to find out how she was murdered because she's convinced that she was murdered. And so Jess starts on this kind of like undercover mission and goes undercover in high London socialite society to find out what happened to Tilly. And it gets so intense, like there are so many plot twists. It's just constant, like one thing after another. The setting also feels quite Gossip Girl because Tilly is an heiress, and so she's got access to, I think, like £40 million, which is where the whole drama comes from. I won't give spoilers, but it's so good if you like Holly Jackson. And then the final book I read is Can You See Me by Rebecca Westcott and Libby Scott. This is quite similar to A Kind of Spark in that it's about an autistic girl who starts in year 7, and similarly, like in A Kind of Spark, it tells you about the autistic experience and kind of different things that somebody with autism might struggle with, like meltdowns and stimming and like anxiety. And there are diary entries from Tally where she explains this, and then she gives the pros and the cons of each. And I really love that it's got that pros and cons kind of setting to kind of get over that like struggling with autism framework which some people use. But the thing that I didn't like about it fits into that like pros and cons structure, because in Elle McNichol's book she really stresses like the positive and the valuable and the like incredible traits that somebody with autism can show. I mean, like with Keedy, for example, I said about loyalty and righteousness and really wanting to follow what is right, or like in A Kind of Spark where Addie becomes infatuated with witches and she wants to learn everything about them, and then she wants everyone to remember these witches, remember what happened to them. And that's so beautiful, that's so powerful, that's the thing I love so much about A Kind of Spark. And in Can You See Me, I don't feel like it worked with her strengths as a character as much as it could have done. And I think it would have been so lovely to see more of like the wonderful qualities that Tally does have, because she does have some wonderful qualities, and it would have been so lovely for those to have been explored, as opposed to depicting autism as like a wholly negative thing. People's opinions might be mixed on that though, and overall, you know, excellent book. I would recommend it to young people to read. The final thing I will mention is The Adolescent by Dostoevsky, which I've also been reading for the like last 2 weeks. Keep in mind that we are on like the 3rd of February now. How many pages in? I'm about 400 pages in. I have been reading this for a lot of January, but I will tell you my thoughts on this when we get into February, because I haven't finished it yet. But that's like kind of been my big book on the go throughout January, and I really do like it. I don't like it as much as other books, but there are some beautiful moments. Like I just read like a kind of offshoot story which I loved, and I've kind of bookmarked to come back and reread because it's brilliant. The characters are so complex. I'd say the first 50 pages are very slow because there's a lot of exposition. There are 3 parts to this book. Didn't like the second half of part 2, but I'm on part 3 now and I really like part 3, so I don't know, it's kind of lulling in and out, and that might just be the way that I'm reading it and sometimes not connecting with it as much. But yeah, I'll give you a full review of this next month. But that brings us to the end of this video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and I may film one of these next month, possibly, because I do love sharing reviews, and I can do more long form reviews than I feel like I can do when I do the yearly wrap up videos, because there's just so much. So yeah, let me know if you want me to do more of these, and thank you for watching, and I hope you have more than just a productive week. I'm also so thirsty after finishing that. I think I'm gonna go downstairs.